Welcome to Brad Explains. On this episode, Brad will explain First Edition Dungeons & Dragons.
Thanks, Greg. You've given me a daunting task. First Edition Dungeons & Dragons. So, back in the day, it's arguable as to, when it actually became Dungeons & Dragons. 1976, 1978, 1979. Some would even say 1981 with the first supplements coming out for it, really. But more or less, Dungeons & Dragons is the granddaddy. It's the big one. It's the foundation. It is the game that introduced role-playing to the world. Okay, in some form or another, it may have existed before then, but before D&D, there wasn't a mainstream. There wasn't a huge mass following. It was all, for the most part, it was, miniatures and war games before this. So, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, got together, and they came out with Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. You're like, well, what happened to, the regular Dungeons & Dragons? Well, there is a separate edition that's just called Dungeons & Dragons, and it was, it just took characters from levels 1 to 3. Later on, it expanded out through the expert, the box sets, basic, expert, companion, masters, immortals, all that stuff. But that was to come later. Originally, Dungeons & Dragons was just levels 1 through 3. It was kind of sort of introductory thing. It was to be a companion to the war game, miniature game. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons delved way deeper into the characters and the roleplay aspect of it. So, that was in 1978 was the first printing of the series of hardback books, Dungeon Master's Guide, Player's Handbook, Monster Manual. They went through several printings, not really edition changes, but printing changes. So you'll see that there's several different covers on the different books. But the game itself was pretty much the same. It's affectionately referred to as Old AD&D or AD&D or First Edition D&D. Any of those are legit. And that's referring to the hardback books, originally 1978-79 releases. And that's the edition we're going to be playing. And that's sort of as a tribute. We want to kick it off with a tribute to Gary and the influence he's had on the entire community of role-playing. This man was the godfather of role-playing games. He was the Beatles, the Elvis, the James Brown, all rolled into one for role-playing games. And so, as sort of a paying homage or a tribute to him, we decided to kick off our multi-system spanning campaign with original AD&D. Plus, I started playing in 1980, 81, and this was the system that I really got into in the beginning, back in the day. So, and that's something that, I've developed several worlds with it, and it was pretty freeform until second edition the D&D came out in 1992. They had the World of Greyhawk was the setting from the original 1978-79 all the way until Forgotten Realms came out in 92. And it was very malleable. You could put all these modules that were printed or all the stuff that you had written into this World of Greyhawk, and it would work. I mean, it was designed to be that way. So what D&D is it's a fantasy role-playing game. This is for those of you that don't know what it is. I'm going to go ahead and humor you. It is a fantasy role-playing game, so in the mode of like Lord of the Rings, which was Gary admitted to saying that was a huge influence on him. Medieval Europe meets Lord of the Rings was what he designed it to be like. But it's Lord of the Rings-ish, much more so because it's fantasy. It's wild magic fantasy, monsters, dragons, orcs, elves, dwarves, swords and sorcery kind of stuff. And that really caught on because that setting, that genre, Lord of the Rings fantasy, was very appealing to a lot of people. And so it made it catch on pretty quick, pretty well. And so that was what they went with, and it worked. Dungeons & Dragons is what they named it. It was, the original war game system that they first introduced with Dave and Gary was called Chainmail. and that was in the early to mid 70s. And that was when it began. They came up with that concept of having characters in this war game that could influence the outcome, and they just ran with it, and it evolved into this role-playing game called Dungeons & Dragons. So I want to explain a little bit about the mechanics of the game. It is not very intuitive. That was the big flaw, and what eventually led to, the later editions changing the mechanics was it wasn't very intuitive. It wasn't very sort of, user-friendly, I guess you could say. The armor class system, for example, which is how you determine if your character is hit or you hit another character. It was based off of these arbitrary numbers where negative was better, and you would get bonuses to your roll, and then you had to cross-reference it on a chart called THAC0 to hit armor class 0, modify your roll via subtraction or addition to get to know what you hit. Very cumbersome. New players, really had to commit to learning. It wasn't, just sit down and teach your buddies to play real quick, unless you had very patient buddies. So, but it was so interesting that people jumped on board. A ton of different dice. There's a 4-sided die, a 6-sided, 8, 10, 12, 20. It introduced all of these dice systems into the game itself, into gaming. So having all these new dice kind of introduced and created for the game itself, they caught on, and they've been used in all these other games that have come out since then. Now, not all new game systems will use the dice, but any old school or avid role-playing game player will definitely recognize a set of those D&D dice. So anyway, D&D is a level-based system. There are some role-playing game systems that are not level-based. They're skill-based. Well, original D&D focused mainly on what level is your character and what class is your character. You can choose to play whether you're playing a dwarf, an elf, or a human, or a gnome, or somebody that's like a half-orc or a halfling. You pick a race, you pick a class, and then everybody makes a character based off of that, and you go on adventures together. It's a co-op play to achieve a goal, whether it's a long-term goal, short-term goal. But all in all, the most important thing is that you work together and you overcome the obstacles that the Dungeon Master puts forth. That's one thing in common that every role-playing game really has, and that is there is a referee or a game master or a dungeon master who sort of kind of behind the scenes, he plays all of the he or she will play all of the interaction characters that the players will meet. Those are called non-player characters, or NPCs, whereas the players, all their characters are called the PCs, or player characters. So the Dungeon Master comes up with the plot. He knows what's going on, what's going to happen down the line, based off of what the characters are going to do. But the players that are playing don't know the outcome of their actions. And actually, to be fair, neither does the Game Master. They just sort of guide it along, and modify and evolve the setting or the story based off of the free-form decisions that the party, which is the collective group of the players, choose to do, and what they act, and whether they succeed or they fail, because not every story is a happy ending either. But anyway, that's role-playing in a nutshell. Almost all of them will have those things in common. So having said that, that is what we'll be doing, and we'll be playing first edition for a while until the characters make their first jump into a new system. So I hope you guys are going to enjoy our story, and I'll let you get to it. Thanks a bunch for listening.
Thank you for listening to Brad Explains. If you have a topic for Brad to explain, or have questions about Dungeons & Dragons, you can find us on Facebook or email us at losersofinitiative@gmail.com.